Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory and you're watching Varietal Literature's YouTube channel. A YouTube channel for a bunch of published writers, mainly me, to do things they love about narrative. And on Tuesday nights, Fairy Tale Tuesdays, we do Fireside Fairytales, which is a collection of folktales and fairy tales that I will read live, a little bit of sound effects and sort of radio drama. It works as a podcast. You don't have to watch it if you prefer it in the background. And tonight, we're looking at the origin of the headless horseman tale. Now, I'm going to be looking specifically at some German tales, because we've been working our way through Jürgen Hubert's translations of previously untranslated German folktale collections. If you've missed those, so the last 2 months we've been peppering some in with some Nordic stuff and so on from Simon Roy Hughes. No Simon Roy Hughes tonight, just German. But we're gonna be looking primarily at the headless horseman tales as they appeared in German folklore, which is likely a big part of where Washington Irving got the Sleepy Hollow story from. It's more than likely. It's basically known. All I'm trying to say is it's not like the tales I read are the only edition of the Headless Horseman tales. They occur across other cultures. I'm just trying to keep us a little focused here. It is what you would call a motif in folklore. Kind of like the Wild Hunt, which if you don't know what that is, check out our episode that it's not Christmas until Odin raids the countryside, which is all about the Wild Hunt. So we're going to be reading stories about headless horsemen in various states, some more deserving than others of their fate, some quite short, some are a little longer. But what we are going to look at in general tonight is ghosts in a state of limbo seeking a kind of salvation or revenge. So we're going to sort of start with the evil end of it with the headless horseman, and then we're going to sort of drift towards the more and more gray, kind of didn't do anything that bad version of hauntings on the tail end. And we're going to end on what I believe to be a fairly beautiful story about ghosts seeking salvation, which is a section in Jürgen Hubert's book. So, with that said, Jürgen Hubert is our translator of all our works tonight. He has a Patreon, which if you're not watching this live, will be a pinned comment below. Consider supporting translators. It's not a lot of money. You get stories every month. There are stories that have never been in the English language before, or were translated poorly when they were last done, but for the most part, they haven't been translated at all. So you'll be some of the first to ever read them if you only speak English, amongst English speakers. If you do not want any description and you just want to get to the stories and you are not watching this live, check the description. There will be timestamps with all of our little stories. In total, we are reading 8 stories, though some are like a paragraph long, some are full stories. It take about an hour. I see that GS says, well, good evening, GS. If you want, by the way, the live chat is up and running. You can say hello to me and ask me questions. I'm not exactly an expert in folklore, although I have been reading quite a bit of it for the last couple of years, so I might be able to give you something. GS says, it's great to hear about these classic tales from a non-Disney perspective. Yeah, and I gotta be clear, like, I don't really take issue with Disney's adaptations of anything, really. I think they're following along with a tradition of storytelling that's been around for a long time. But I will say this, the way that they try to make it their own and let no one else use it, well, they can go to hell for that. But the actual storytelling and the modifying of the original and making it appeal more to like modern audiences, well, that's what bards have been doing for generations. So, you know, that's fine. Okay, I won't faff about anymore. Our first tales are about the headless horseman. In fact, our first, I believe, 5 tales are all about, explicitly, various versions of the headless horseman. As I said, some are short, some are long. I'll name them and introduce them as I go along, but I'm going to kind of read these in a pack, and then I'll stop a little bit and discuss them. But my first stories, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, as it says in the notes here, was published in 1820. Most of these stories predate that by quite a bit. And Washington Irving would have been amongst people that were not that long ago came over from the places like Germany with these tales in tow. So it's not accidental, nor is it absurd to say that basically Sleepy Hollow is his own version of these tales. On the first story, and again, if you're not watching it live, you can skip this if this is a problem for you. A bit of a content warning. I don't explicitly make these for children anyways, but this is a bit more than that. My content warning here is that there is domestic violence in this story and murder. So if that's something that's a bit triggering for you, just skip to the next one, which will be Rider Without a Head, in brackets Lengfeld. And you won't miss much. Okay. Our first story in our series about the Headless Horseman tonight is The Rider Without a Head on the Ziegenberg Hill near Zwönitz. And it's from the book Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles, which you can pretty sure only get through the Patreon, maybe not only, but largely get through the Patreon, put together by its translator, Jürgen Hubert, whose contact info and Patreon info is down in the pinned comment below. The Rider Without a Head on the Ziegenberg Hill near Zwönitz. Actually, I'm going to turn the music down just a little bit. Let's get a little spookier. A rider without a head allegedly can be seen on the Ziegenberg, a cone-shaped hill with a height of almost 300 ells. People tell the following legend about this apparition. In the 17th century, there was said to be a miller in Zwönitz that had a very beautiful daughter. But the daughter was secretly engaged to the forester of Greenhain. The forester knew almost none of her other relatives, for the miller also had a son, but had renounced him because he married the headsman's daughter without his permission, and thus, according to the convictions of that time, dishonored his family. Nevertheless, the siblings continued to meet at various places, and when the beautiful miller's daughter went dancing in the pub where she had intended to meet her beloved, she met her brother and his wife, and of course she couldn't deny him a short dance. But in the meantime, the forester had arrived, and he hurried from his horse into the dancing hall without changing stride, and there he beheld his bride in the arms of a stranger. And when he saw her joking with this stranger in a friendly manner, he was gripped by raging jealousy. He thus lured her out to Ziegenberg Hill with flattering words. He pretended that he had lost something in the forest during his gallop and asked her to help him with the search. Well, the girl accompanied him, suspecting no malice. Remember, content warning here. But when they reached an overgrown spot on the hill, he accused her of infidelity and stabbed her without even listening to her defense. Unfortunately, his aim was only too true. and the unfortunate girl died within a few minutes, in which she had only enough time to tell her murderer that the alleged seducer had been her brother, who had been unknown to him. In wild despair, the forester threw himself over the dying woman, but he was unable to bring her back to life. He thus hurried to the dancing hall and cried out to her brother that he had murdered his sister and wanted to turn himself over to the courts. And this indeed happened. As he sought death, the investigation did not take long. Why was there an investigation at all? And after only 3 moons, his guilty head fell on the scaffold at Greenhain. On the spot where the bloody deed was done, a white rose bush was planted, whose roses look like they are sprinkled with blood at night, and whose leaves seem to bow down to the ground in grief. But when bad times are approaching, a rider with his head beneath his arm rides forth at midnight from the high court of Greenhain towards the rose tree, stays there for a short time, and then rides again. By the way, it's supposed to be like, oh, how tragic. If only he knew it was her brother. Who cares if it wasn't her brother? He stabbed her for dancing with someone. If you need some moral guidance, that's not a good reason to stab anyone. This tale is called The Rider Without a Head. It's also a part of our headless horseman discussion here. And it is also from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, translations by Jürgen Hubert of old German tales. In this one, we see the first of a bit of an odd association, which is to stones. In this case, a gravestone for this short little tale. The Rider Without a Head, Lengfeld. There was once a moss-covered stone cross about 3.5 feet in high. There was once a moss-covered stone with a cross about 3.5 feet in height that stood within a hazelnut hedge beneath the village of Lengfeld. Alongside the court, Tutema, at a farm boundary where fields were encroaching from the higher side. This cross was only removed recently. According to legend, a horseman lies buried beneath this cross along with his horse. Both were decapitated at this spot during the 30 Years' War, and during the 12th hour, the rider climbs on his horse, which lacks a head just like he does, and then he slowly rides around the cross. But with the last chime of the bell, he vanishes as well. So we see this first association of the headless horseman to stones. And something that I think is actually kind of interesting that runs in the background of all the stories we're going to read tonight, even the ones that stop being about the headless horseman and more about spirits that are stuck here for various reasons, is the significance of stones. In this case, a gravestone. In the next one, a slightly different kind of use of a stone. Let's say a funnier one, anyways. This one is called The Rider on the Pale Horse, and it's also from Sunken Castle Evil Poodles. Uncanny forces are at work in the Tannenkamp near Krummen on the Usedom. For people frequently see a rider without a head soaring closer and closer. This rider soon takes on all sorts of shapes and then transforms himself into a large, gray stone. Well, in this form, he remains lying next to the road and has frequently caused horses to become frightened from its presence. And because of this, many people have suffered great damage to their wagons and their horses. Sorry, their harnesses. Again, a little short anecdote, but I particularly like this very direct association of a stone on the side of the road that's actually a headless horseman. Man, that's an idea I would never have. Folktales are strange, my friends. Folktales are strange. Okay. So we see again that, like, for various reasons, the headless horseman gets associated to stones, but we also see that stones gain this significance, right? There can be stones that scare off horses. There can be gravestones. And in the next one is perhaps for me the most metaphorically interesting stone use that's going to come up in multiple ghost stories. And that is the idea of a boundary stone. Now, a boundary stone here isn't anything too superstitious, though boundaries are a concept, of course, in superstitions, but all it is a stone that marks your land out. Which is doubly interesting because ghosts are something that are infringing on boundaries between worlds as well. I guess I won't say more than that, because I think it's enough to sort of look at it poetically and feel it before you really break it down into an essay or something. Okay. This is the rider without a head from Mückenloch. At the entrance of the Mückenloch forest, the path leads across a bridge. After crossing that bridge, it is sometimes possible to see a man riding on a pale horse. And he carries his head beneath his arm like a hat. And he pursues people that come across him and likes to lead them astray. But he cannot cross the ditch that is located nearby, and thus people are safe from him beyond it. He also can only leave this forest for a short stretch of the road and vanishes at the large boundary stone where that stretch ends. It is said that during his lifetime, he was a land surveyor who committed such frauds in this region that he now must haunt this area as a punishment. So in several ways, I find this to be one of the most... I know it's, again, short. We have a longer one yet. I find this one particularly interesting, though, because one of the main things, of course, and you know, in the tales of Washington Irving, is the forest was haunted by the headless horseman, but he could not cross that bridge. In the actually, I guess I can't say for sure. I don't think I've ever. No, I have read it. Never mind. I was going to say I'm not sure I've ever read that novella, but I realize I have read it because I remember. If you've never read it, it's tremendously racist. I'm laughing because it's a thing that in no way needed to do anything with race. It's about a headless horseman in a forest, but no, it's tremendously racist, which is, I remember a couple of years ago I was going to read it for Halloween. But anyways, in that, there's this boundary restriction, but it's defined by a bridge. But you find that in, here is that same idea. You know, it's boundary restricted and it disappears and so on. However, it's a stone. And we get to the significance of a stone here, which is stones can be gravestones, but they can also be boundary stones. And land surveyors are the ones who would define your lands. And obviously there's a reason why they might take bribes to give someone a bit more land than they should have. Or, for themselves. So we see this use of the boundary stone to be a boundary for the undead as a punishment for their life, but also a literal boundary on the lands probably defined by him. And that brings us to something that I think kind of connects these ideas together. And again, that sort of folklore, dream logic way. And that is, what do boundary stones really mean to people who would have been telling these stories? And what they mean is my land. Most of the people telling these stories would have been like farmers or otherwise sort of just regular workers. And so you'll notice that we're going to look at some stories that look at the nature of boundaries being infringed specifically onto like farms and how that leads to creative punishments for the people that are guilty of infringing on farmers, right? So we see the boundary stone thing again. We see this association of stones again to the headless horseman, knowing that stones can be gravestones and stones can be boundary stones. We've seen that a couple of times from different regions. And now we're going to see where boundary stones really matter, which is if you're a farmer, all that land, any inch of land you can farm is profit and value, and any that is stolen from you is loss. That could mean, bankruptcy, right? So this last story, I think, ties some of that together. This is The Rider Within the Beeches of Klosterlausnitz, I think. Again, from Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles, translated by Jürgen Hubert. During the nights of the new moon, nobody likes to go into the beech woods of Klosterlausnitz, or indeed into their general vicinity, and whoever is able to do so takes a different route that leads around this place because it's evil. For in the night of the new moon, a ghostly horseman rides. Through the beaches were shouts of "Hey-o! Hooray!" And many have seen that he is missing a head, and while others saw him with a hunter's hat. But he rides on a pale horse, and that much is certain. It is the spirit of an old huntsman who maltreated the farmers and devastated their fields along with his companions while hunting game. He had impudently bragged that neither God nor the devil could touch him. This appeared to be true during his life, which seemed charmed. He had received high honors and respect from distinguished people until he reached the end of his life. But then his fortunes changed, for God does not tolerate mockers. Now the huntsman rides around in the hunting grounds he favored when he was alive, and his restless soul waits for deliverance. All right. So, there are actually some more Headless Horseman stories, but they do kind of start to follow along with that same trend, so I'm going to move that idea over a bit. So what we've seen so far is we've seen riders without a heads, which are sort of these spirits that for one reason or another are stuck here. In the first one story that we read, they were stuck here because they murdered their lover. In the second story, actually in a lot of them, they don't tell us why they're stuck there, but in the ones that they do, one is it's stuck to its gravestone. One is that it seems to be bound by its own boundary stones, which is a curse it brought on itself by being a dishonest land surveyor who would have set such boundary stones. When we get down to it, though, what we see in this story is what really sits at the heart of boundary stones, which is people who would disrespect boundary stones are people that would disrespect the farmers, who probably made up a lot of these stories, or were the core audience for them anyways. And we see there's this kind of, if you ruin my family's livelihood, basically by stealing my farmland or wrecking it with your hunts, well, then you'll be cursed. Which is cathartic if you are, trying to survive and surrounded by petulant trust fund children who run around on horses and ruin your land. Keeping with that idea, though, we're going to look at another ghost that seeks salvation. And we're going to look at ones that are a little more redemptive, aren't headless and on horses. So if you just came for the headless horseman, thank you so much for coming out. The next 3 stories are not about headless horsemen. They are about spirits in similar predicaments. And they do start to concern more and more this idea of the infringement of boundaries and disrespect of stones. Which brings us up to... Just give me a moment here. Again, I can't really jump to it, unfortunately. I see that GS says, I definitely like the boundary story and I don't know why. That's a good thing to interrogate, probably. Some guy was cursing the stone who spooked his horse. Yeah, made up a story about it. This is a very short story, but very significant, I think, when we're looking at the trends of this story. And that is the farmer who had moved the boundary stones. Sorry. The farmer who had moved the boundary stones, which is from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, where we see these stones returning and cursing ghosts. Once a farmer in Lichtenberg died, but he had moved boundary stones in his life, and in this manner increased the size of his own land. So he stole land, basically, from his neighbor farmers. Now, as a punishment from the unknown cosmos for moving these stones, he then, as a ghost in the afterlife, had to carry the boundary stones around in his arms while wandering around the field at night. And so the people who passed by late in the evening heard him moan and call out, "Where am I going to put them?" While one person, a clever fellow, had heard this, gathered his courage, and shouted back to him, "You old scoundrel! Put them where you got them from!" And since then, no one has heard from that ghost. I mean, it's a very similar sort of crime to that other, to the land surveyor, headless horseman, which I find interesting. It's obvious that this was a problem at the time. It was obvious that people stole land by moving stones, right? Which makes sense, because I imagine that would be one major way of, like, defining your land. There's a big stone at the corner of it. So if you can find a way to move it, you got yourself some land. Now, this one is called The Unrighteous Plowman, and I am going to give a translator's notes here because I think it's important to understanding the meaning of this short story. Unrighteous means here, let me go to his notes here. The ghostly plowman, this is the translator's notes, so this is Jürgen. The ghostly plowman is described as falsch in the text and the title. A literal translation of this would be false or wrong, but in this context I settled for unrighteous in the sense of bearing false witness. I think that is important to know. The unrighteous plowman, in other words, one who bore false witness. In the past, a man with a glowing plow was plowing every night between 11 and 12 o'clock on a swampy meadow between Hunsen and Hull. He was condemned to this fate because he once cut away a piece of his neighbor's land with his plow. He had to labor until the entire land, which he had obtained unjustly, and was returned to its proper owner. However, in each hour, he was only able to move a single grain of sand. Many years ago, another man talked with him and offered to plow for him. He did as offered, but once he had finished, the plow and the harness vanished. And the ghost has not returned since then, for the last of the stolen land had been returned to the neighbor thanks to his effort, and thus the unrighteous plowman finally found peace in the grave. And I think to put this in modern terms, it'd be like if you had, I know a lot of people have this, if you had a big backyard that didn't really have a fence, but it had a clear kind of property line, and just your neighbor was slowly mowing a little bit more of the lawn every day. And you're like, the side of my house is getting more narrow. And then you went to him and was like, you are taking my land. He was like, no, I'm not. And then he like made a garden on the part that he stole from you. Now, most of my audience, according to YouTube statistics, are millennials, like myself. We don't know anything about owning land, so I'm theorizing. So a whole generation that owns land that we are waiting for, I think. Okay, so that brings us to our last and our longest. GS says, like a teacher making you write, I will not cheat 100 times. Exactly. Because I think it's easy to put yourself in the headspace of like where you would bring this story up, right? Like, you know, you're kind of trying to push a certain moral of like, listen, if you do that, God's gonna make you do it a certain way for the rest of your life when you die, right? Like a lot of this is sort of like when you die, that's when moral justice will come. And so, you know, it's an attempt to get people to behave better. I don't think it worked. Okay. Which brings us to our last story. Our last story is our longest story, and I think our prettiest of the month. It fits the least with our theme. It was something that was sort of hard to find a home for. But it does fit with our theme sort of secondary focus, which is it's about ghosts seeking salvation. I would say they have done the least wrong. And that might mean something to you. It does to me. So this story is from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles. It is a very beautiful folktale called The Ghostly Wedding in the Deserted Village of Scortowe. Once there was an ancient village on the Wends. In the Schortental valley near Ziegenberg. But this was a long, long time ago. The village was named Scortowe. Many years ago, this village was abandoned and now nothing of it is visible anymore. However, in earlier times it was frequently seen during certain blessed nights and during the right hour. In the middle of the Schortental Valley, on a green, quiet forest meadow. But now no one can behold it anymore, for it was released from the heavy curse which made it visible in holy nights every 10th leap year, which is like 40 years. Let me tell you how the curse was lifted. Quite a few years ago, there was an honest, poor girl in Eisenberg who had arrived with Protestants emigrating from Salzburg and found a place to stay with compassionate locals. And one evening, when it was already turning dark, she was sent out in order to fetch some feed. For the livestock from the Scortowe valley. As she was unafraid, she fearlessly proceeded through the rustling woods, which were quiet in the evening, until she finally safely arrived in the meadow in the Scortowe, where she usually gathered the requested feed. But instead of a meadow, she beheld a old village before her, which was unknown to her and whose name she did not know. The lights shimmered out of its small, old-fashioned houses, and initially she was startled and frightened, but soon she gathered her courage and knocked carefully on the windows of the first brightly lit house. She asked for directions as well as where she was, and as she was rather hungry and thirsty, pleaded for a piece of bread and a bit of water to drink. Now, an old man with a white beard and strange garb opened the window and told the girl to come in. Nervously, she followed the invitation and entered the low chamber in which a merry group seemed to be celebrating a wedding. Demurely, she greeted them and repeated her request for the bread, the water, and directions. Upon hearing this, the old man who had invited her in bade her to sit down and passed food and drink in strangely formed cups and bowls to her. As far as she could see, everything in the entire chamber seemed to be like it was from an old, long ago time. Bowls and cutlery, tables and chairs, everything was fantastically strange and unfamiliar. All the guests wore strange garb out of a long-lost time, and with old-fashioned and baggy suits and dresses. The bride was costumed like a nun, with a long flowing veil and severe garb right out of a monastery. The groom, on the other hand, he was wearing luxurious tunic, embroidered with gold and silver in the manner of a knight, a long, glittering rapier at his side, as well as a heavy golden honor chain on his chest. The old man sympathetically questioned the girl about her situation and her circumstances. And it seemed that once he was convinced of her poverty and indeed her good, honest heart, he rushed off to speak with the groom for a long time in a strange language she did not know. After that, the knight approached her with visibly delighted countenance and said, "My thanks, my child, that you have come here. Soon we will attain eternal joy and peace." Thus, the wedding dances started, which were odd dances, accompanied by strange, fantastic music. Come on. which the girl had never danced to before, rather. Only now and then there was a dance she was familiar with, and she always danced with those with the handsome groom. Finally, a weird dance started that involved the most fantastic jumps and turns. And in the middle of the merry, carefree pirouettes, it suddenly became calm and quiet. There were 12 blows of the horn that reverberated eerily through the night. And then there was silence. The cheerful party of the guests, the merry musicians, the old peculiar tables, the cutlery, and the whole strange village vanished all at once. As the poor girl looked around in consternation, she once again stood alone in the dark night on the quiet forest meadow and did not know what had happened to her. So she quickly hurried home. It was there, when she was home, that she discovered a beret had been added to her basket. And she remembered it, for it had been worn by the handsome groom, the one with the great rapier and the fine silver and gold embroidery. And within the beret there were quite a few old, heavy gold and silver coins, which she could definitely use. But there was as well a rolled-up, yellowed sheet of parchment, and on it was written in Gothic letters, in this: in the year 1400, the knight Siegenberg von Heinsberg, the knight as in soldier, abducted the noble maiden Elspeta von Königsberg from the convent at Eisenberg. He married her at the home of a sympathetic serf belonging to the convent, and lived a happy and blessed life with her until his demise. However, after their death, in the great beyond, in the court of your life, it was judged to be a major sin to have pulled her from the convent. And so they had to spend 100 years of torment in purgatory. But then, after the convent had long been abandoned and the village of Scortowe had been razed in the 30 Years' War, they had to stage mock weddings in the same location. They were to repeat this in every 10th leap year on the day of the full moon, while the sun was located in the sign of Cancer, until a poor but honest and fearless girl would visit them 3 hours before midnight and ask for something. Now many years had passed since then, and 33 leap years have gone by. Many people have seen the abandoned village, but no honest girl has dared to approach it alone during the blessed hour. Pray an Ave Maria for our restless souls. End the parchment quote. In this manner, the honest, brave girl had, somewhat unwittingly, released the poor couple and helped them find peace in the grave. The blessings of this deed, however, remained and showed itself through her entire fortunate life. For they say it was as if the ghosts from the village of Scortowe, who had attained the longed-for peace, were always gratefully watching out for her and faithfully guarded and protected her. And that was the ghostly wedding in the deserted village of Scortowe. GS says, cool story, leave the nuns alone. Um, yeah, I would say that it's likely the source on this story was, guys coming and charming nuns away from the convent. So they were like, how do we deal with this? But it's interesting because while it is judged a sin, it's not seen as a bad thing. Like, it's weird because normally in these stories, they're like the first half when we were talking more about the headless horseman, where, they're doomed to be this headless beast trapped in certain regions or rituals. Sometimes you can release them, most times you can't. They yearn for people to do something nearly impossibly selfless to release them or something. But with this story, it's a lot more like just a kind of romance where the purpose seems to be a lot more about, yes, it was a sin, but they had a beautiful life and found peace after all. Like, it doesn't seem to be a case against it. That's my point. So I think the moral of the story is, look, you might have some rough times, but if you really love a nun, elope with a nun. And I think that is probably a perfect point to end our ghost month on, which means I should probably mention what kind of tales we're covering next month. But as always, it is sort of stories I find interesting each week, but I try to kind of adhere to certain themes and structures so people have some idea of what I'm doing in any span of time. And what I want to look at next month is sort of cryptids and creatures that I know from places like Dungeons and Dragons, things that have come up like dwarves and kobolds and dragons and giants and various forms of water spirits and werewolves and stuff like this. I want to look at these spirits, but in their old folklore conceptions. Gia says, and they got to party every 40 years. That's true. Which is probably more than I've been partying. But I want to look at sort of the origin of cryptids. And I think I'll probably do that as well. But there's also, what I think I will do next week specifically, though, is really, I don't know how I'm going to market it. So if you're watching this right now, please tune in next week, because there is no way for me to adequately describe what is a very interesting thing about Nordic folklore. It's these very strange concepts. They are kind of related to ghosts, and I was thinking of putting it in our ghost month, but ultimately I made the choices I made. But I think you should tune in. It's about these sort of premonition concepts in Nordic myth that makes sense when you hear stories on it. Something I've never seen discussed in English. We'll also probably read a more traditional fairy tale from Nordic myth, because it's been a while since we've had just a good things happen in threes, repetitive fairy tale on this channel. But for the most part, what February will be is likely a lot of cryptids. No, maybe for Valentine's Day we'll look at sort of love curses, because I think there are a few stories I haven't looked at in that direction. We'll see. But if you like the video, please remember to like it. That is the stitch that holds together a channel, unfortunately. YouTube has a gun to the back of my head. You can't see them. YouTube has a gun back of my head, and they're whispering in my ear, and they're like, you can put all the effort you want into something, but if they don't engage, I'm burying it, and you with it. So yeah, like the video if you liked it. And subscribe to the video if you or to the channel if you haven't already, if you want to help me out. And if you don't care, that's fine. I hope you enjoyed the stories. You don't owe me anything. Nonetheless, though, I will keep the fire warm for you. I hope you have a good sleep. Good night.